They were so digesting actually. There's a lot of mixed feelings between sort of excitement and nervousness.
Behind a sealed palace door, with the winter light falling flat across old carpets and dispatch boxes, Princess Anne did something almost no one inside the royal household believed she would ever do. She spoke plainly, without softening a single edge, and in doing so she revealed a palace secret so consequential, so deeply tied to the future of the crown, that Prince William's next move could no longer be delayed. This was not a routine family conversation. It was not a private complaint from a weary royal sibling. It was the release of a truth that had been contained for months, behind briefings, silences, and carefully managed appearances. And the moment it emerged, the question was no longer whether the monarchy was under strain. The question was how much had already changed before the country was permitted to see it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss a single update. Because what unfolded here was not just another palace disagreement, and not just another difficult chapter inside a famous family. It was a moment of reckoning between the present reign and the future reign, between loyalty and preparation, between a son waiting to be careful and an aunt deciding that caution had finally become dangerous. Britain had expected an ordinary week of royal scheduling. A few engagements, a few photographs, a few carefully balanced messages of continuity. Instead, whispers began moving through Westminster, through private offices, through the circles where constitutional language is spoken, in low voices, and nothing important is ever written carelessly. The first reports sounded almost too strange to believe. Princess Anne, the one figure in the family known more for discipline than display, had broken with protocol in a way that could alter William's position almost overnight. What she revealed was not a scandal in the usual sense. There was no stolen money, no exposed affair, no crude act of disloyalty that could be packaged into a tabloid headline and forgotten 3 days later. The truth was more painful. Anne disclosed that a hidden layer of contingency planning had been moved further forward than publicly acknowledged. Planning for transition, planning for delegation, planning for a constitutional burden that everyone kept describing as distant, but which certain palace figures had quietly begun treating as near enough to organize around. That mattered, because succession is not only about who inherits the crown, it is about who must begin living like the next sovereign long before the crown is actually theirs. And if that sounds abstract, inside a palace, it is not abstract at all. It means papers change hands. It means routes of communication narrow. It means diaries are redrawn with a different purpose. It means one household begins preparing to think like the central household. It means that private tenderness becomes less useful than constitutional clarity. The country saw one thing. Inside the family, the truth was far more painful. The first person to understand the full meaning of Anne's words was not a journalist and not a minister. It was William. Those close enough to the family to hear the early account said his reaction was not explosive. No slammed doors, no public fury, no theatrical scene. But that almost made it worse. He had expected concern. He had not expected the timeline to have shifted so far beneath the surface without a public acknowledgement. He had expected caution. He had not expected that his aunt, of all people, would decide the silence could no longer hold. Catherine, it is said, understood immediately why Anne had chosen this moment. Not because she enjoyed the shock, and certainly not because she wished to deepen the family strain, but because she had seen how the emotional burden of uncertainty had begun to distort everything around William. He was neither fully permitted to remain only the heir, nor openly invited to step into the fuller gravity of preparation. He was being asked to stand still while the machinery around him quietly accelerated. That is a dangerous place for any future king. A monarchy can survive criticism. It can survive gossip. It can survive embarrassing headlines. But it cannot easily survive confusion about where authority will have to fall when pressure suddenly arrives. Anne's disclosure, according to those who later pieced it together, came during a conversation that had not even been intended for wider significance. It began as a tightly held internal exchange about scheduling, institutional coverage, and the strain of overlapping responsibilities. But when the discussion turned once again toward delay, toward the language of patience, toward the insistence that William's next major step should wait just a little longer, Anne stopped the room cold. She looked across the table and made clear that the palace had already moved beyond the point where delay could honestly be defended. The preparations were real. The assumptions were real. The private acknowledgments were real. Pretending otherwise, she suggested, was no longer protective. It was destabilizing. No one raised their voice, but the silence deepened. To understand why Princess Anne crossed that line, you have to go back to an earlier palace moment that never made front pages in its true form. On the surface, it had looked simple enough. A ceremonial review, a sequence of meetings, a chain of appearances meant to reinforce steadiness. Those occasions often matter more than they appear to matter, because ceremony in royal life is not decoration, it is signal. It tells the country who is central, who is ready, who is relied upon, who is being tested. And during that earlier period, something happened that rattled more experienced eyes inside the institution than the public ever realized. There had been a private briefing following a state-linked function, one of those heavy afternoons of uniforms, papers, timings, and constitutional niceties. The official household was present. That term sounds domestic, but it is not. The official household is the operational structure around the crown, the network of private secretaries, senior aides, ceremonial planners, and constitutional coordinators, whose job is to make sure symbolism never slips into disorder. During that briefing, a discrepancy emerged. Certain assumptions about coverage, representation, and decision flow had been written as though William's office would take on a broader stabilizing role sooner rather than later. Yet publicly, the palace line remained restrained and almost passive. At first, it was treated as an internal drafting matter, a wording issue, a planning overreach, something to be corrected quietly. But Anne noticed what others preferred not to say aloud. This was not one draft. It was a pattern. Separate papers, separate offices, separate conversations were all beginning to move in the same direction. Not publicly, never directly, but unmistakably. The system was preparing around a future that people were still refusing to describe honestly. Princess Anne had spent her life inside the machinery of monarchy. She understood hierarchy, but she also understood denial. She knew the difference between patience and avoidance, and she knew that William, for all his discipline, would not force the issue while his father remained determined to preserve every appearance of normal order. That was the family tragedy sitting beneath the constitutional question. William's restraint came from loyalty. Yet that same loyalty was leaving him trapped in a version of the present that key insiders no longer truly believed in. The decision was not born that morning. It had been growing in Anne for weeks. There was another incident, smaller on paper but sharper in emotional effect. During a closed planning session connected to future overseas coverage and major state obligations, a senior figure reportedly raised the need for enhanced continuity posture around William. The phrase sounded bureaucratic, but in palace language it was loaded. Continuity meant the visible assurance that the crown would function without interruption. Posture meant not legal transfer, but lived preparation. One could hear the terms and still pretend nothing had changed. Anne did not pretend. She asked the question others avoided. If you are planning around enhanced continuity through William, why are you still speaking to him as though he is merely waiting for some undefined future season? That room, by several later accounts, went cold. William learned of that exchange later, and it affected him more than those around him initially understood. Not because he hungered for advancement. Everything said about him in serious royal circles has long suggested the opposite. He is careful to the point of discomfort when it comes to institutional timing, but because the revelation exposed something deeply unfair, the burden was being moved toward him privately, while the language around him remained deliberately incomplete. He was being relied upon and restrained at the same time. That tension followed him home. It is said that one evening, after a day of outward composure, William sat with Catherine and spoke more openly than he usually permitted himself to do. He did not complain about duty. He did not resent his father. He did not speak with bitterness about the monarchy he had been raised to serve. He spoke instead about uncertainty, about the emotional cost of preparing in silence for responsibilities that no one wished to name, about the strange isolation of carrying a future that has already started arriving while everyone insists it has not. Catherine listened in the way only those closest to great public figures often do. not interrupting, not dramatizing, not diminishing, simply allowing the truth to settle. She knew what was happening to him. She had seen the quiet recalibration in how offices approached him, how expectations landed on his desk, how symbolic weight began to attach itself to even minor appearances. She also knew the danger of allowing that transformation to happen without clarity. The public can accept a burden. It struggles with ambiguity. A family can manage pain. It struggles with silence that begins to feel like evasion. But the most difficult confrontation was still to come. At some point after Anne's concerns deepened, William sought a private conversation with the king. Accounts differ on where it took place. Some say Windsor, some say a quieter room in London used for family discussions precisely because it feels less official than the rooms where state papers are handled. The exact setting matters less than the emotional truth of it. Father and son sat together in the shadow of the same institution, both loyal to it, both wounded by what it required, and both carrying different fears about what would happen if reality was spoken too clearly. Charles, by those same accounts, was not defensive in the crude sense. He did not reject William, he did not dismiss the concern, but he remained instinctively attached to continuity through steadiness of image. He believed, perhaps sincerely, that too much visible acceleration toward the future could create the impression of retreat in the present, and that mattered to him. It mattered as a sovereign, and it mattered as a father who did not want the transition between one generation and the next to feel like a public farewell while the current reign still stood. William's position was more painful. He was not asking for a crown. He was asking for honesty about the burden already forming around him. No one raised their voice, but this was not a gentle exchange. These are the arguments that cut deepest in royal life, because they are rarely about personalities alone. They are about timing, symbolism, duty, protection, and the terrible cost of saying the truth too late. William, it is said, made clear that if more was expected of him operationally, then the structure needed to reflect that reality, not with fanfare, not with destabilizing announcements, but with internal clarity and a coherent outward posture. Charles understood the logic, yet understanding and accepting are not the same thing. Anne later learned enough about that conversation to confirm her worst fear. The issue had been acknowledged emotionally, but still not resolved institutionally. And that, to her, was the most dangerous combination of all. A monarchy can survive difficult truths when they are organized. It struggles when truths are felt privately and handled incompletely. So when the next internal discussion arrived, Anne decided she would no longer protect the silence itself. Her authority in that moment came from something more powerful than title. It came from reputation. Princess Anne has spent decades being regarded as one of the least theatrical and most dutiful figures in the family. She does not trade in melodrama. She does not lean on spectacle. She says less than others, which is precisely why, when she finally spoke plainly, the effect was devastating. People inside the room knew immediately that this was not a passing frustration. If Anne believed the silence had become dangerous, then the silence had already gone too far. She laid out what had been quietly developing. Advisory consultations had been broadened. Coverage assumptions had changed. Certain continuity memos had moved from theoretical drafting to practical alignment. Senior palace structures had been asked to think not only about preservation of the present reign, but about the resilience of the next phase if heavier constitutional pressure emerged. A regency, in strict constitutional terms, is a formal arrangement for sovereign incapacity under law. This was not that. Anne was careful on that point, but what she described was still explosive. The palace had begun operationally preparing around contingencies that made William's role more immediate than the public narrative suggested. That was the secret. Not an official transfer, not an abdication plan signed in some dramatic midnight ceremony. The reality was subtler and, in some ways, more serious. The institution had entered a zone of accelerated preparedness while maintaining a language of ordinary continuity. There are times when such discretion is wise. This, Anne believed, was no longer one of those times. When news of her intervention moved beyond the original room, it did what palace managers most fear. It escaped the tidy categories designed to contain it. At first, it emerged in fragments. A senior royal had spoken forcefully. A family truth had shifted. William was expected to reconsider his next move. Then the outlines grew sharper. Broadcasters began receiving hints of a significant behind-the-scenes disagreement about the pace of royal preparation. Commentators who usually traffic only in shallow rumor suddenly found themselves hearing similar descriptions from more serious quarters. That is often how palace leaks become unmistakable. Not when the first whisper appears, but when entirely separate circles begin repeating the same core shape. The public reaction was immediate, because the emotional stakes were instantly clear. People understand family strain. They understand the burden of an heir. They understand the image of a loyal son being asked to wait politely, while the future gathers around him anyway. Newspaper headlines hardened within hours. Some framed Anne as the truth-teller the palace could no longer silence. Others warned of constitutional overinterpretation. Some suggested a family rift. Others described an overdue moment of realism. Yet beneath all the different angles was one shared recognition. Something had shifted, and the shift had come from inside the innermost ring of trust. Crowds outside royal residences did what crowds always do at moments like this. They watched, they speculated, they searched faces for confirmation. Every appearance suddenly mattered more than it had the day before. If William looked grave, it meant resolve. If he looked calm, it meant preparation. If Catherine stood close, it meant solidarity. If the king appeared composed, it meant authority. Public life around the monarchy is often read like a language, and during these moments every gesture becomes a sentence. Inside the palace, however, the atmosphere was less theatrical and far more strained. The revelation had not created the problem. It had stripped away the last easy excuse for avoiding it. William now had to decide whether to maintain the same patient public posture or begin quietly recalibrating his role in a way that would be visible to anyone paying close attention. That was what the title of the drama truly meant. Anne had not handed him a crown. She had handed him a decision. His next move would matter because it would signal whether he intended to go on absorbing expanding responsibility in silence or whether he would begin shaping the reality himself. There were several paths before him, and none were comfortable. He could do nothing visible, hoping that the storm would settle and that the institution would reorganize itself without further public friction. But that carried danger. Inaction, after Anne's disclosure, could look like weakness or denial. He could seek another private agreement with the king and insist on greater internal clarity while keeping public change minimal. That was the most loyal option, but perhaps also the most exhausting. Or he could begin accepting a visibly widened constitutional presence, not as a challenge to his father, but as a sober recognition that continuity now required more than careful silence. That final option terrified palace traditionalists because symbolism matters as much as law. The moment the heir begins looking too much like the center of institutional gravity, even if the sovereign remains fully sovereign, the emotional psychology of the reign starts to change. Yet Anne believed the greater danger now lay in pretending that no such change was already underway. The story did not end with the leak. In truth, that was where it truly became human. Charles, when informed of how far Anne's words had traveled, was said to have received the news with that controlled stillness, familiar to those who know him well. It would be easy to imagine anger, but the reality appears to have been more complicated. He knew his sister. He knew she did not act for attention. He knew that if she had crossed that line, she believed the institutional cost of silence had become too high. That mattered because it prevented him from simply dismissing her as disloyal. The wound was deeper than that. It came from being confronted by someone whose loyalty had always been unquestioned. There is a particular sadness in royal families when the most dutiful voices begin speaking like alarm bells. It means the pressure has reached people who normally absorb pressure without complaint. A second family discussion followed, more focused, less avoidable. William attended not as a restless heir seeking momentum, but as a future sovereign asking for coherence. Anne attended not as a rebellious aunt, but as the one person who had finally forced the buried issue into daylight. Others were present in parts, including advisors whose role was not emotional, but constitutional. A constitutional advisor is not a political actor in the ordinary sense. The role exists to protect lawful continuity, to make sure institutional actions remain sound, proportionate, and survivable under scrutiny. When such people are drawn closer to a family tension, it means the tension is no longer merely personal. The conversation turned to practicalities, representation, senior coverage, priority structures, information routing, symbolic positioning. These may sound technical, but every one of them carries moral weight when applied to a monarchy. Representation is who stands in the sovereign's place. Priority structure is who becomes the visible bearer of central obligations. Information routing is who is trusted early enough to act wisely. Symbolic positioning is how the country begins to understand who already carries tomorrow inside today. William listened carefully and, according to those with knowledge of the mood, spoke with unusual directness. He made clear that he would not participate in any arrangement that made his father look eclipsed. That line was essential to him. He would not wound the present reign in order to prepare for the next. But he also made clear that uncertainty itself had become corrosive. If responsibilities were broadening, then support systems, briefings, and institutional expectations had to reflect that honestly, not publicly in flamboyant terms, but concretely. Anne supported him, and that support changed everything. Because once Anne aligned herself openly with William's need for greater clarity, the argument ceased to look like generational impatience. It began to look like an institutional judgment from within the family's most disciplined ranks. The monarchy could ignore gossip. It could not lightly ignore that. And Catherine, though not central in the procedural sense, was central in another way. Her presence at key moments in the days that followed reportedly brought calm to an atmosphere that might otherwise have tipped into visible fracture. She understood, perhaps more instinctively than many around her, that the country would not only be judging structure, it would be judging emotional steadiness. A future queen does not merely accompany a constitutional transition. She absorbs its atmosphere, steadies its edges, and humanizes its burden. That was already happening around her, whether or not anyone wished to say it aloud. The leak continued to spread, and with it came inevitable distortions. Some claimed Anne had demanded an immediate transfer of power. Others suggested William was preparing a dramatic public stance. A few lurid voices even spoke of open palace warfare. Those accounts missed the truth because they misunderstood the tone of royal conflict. The most consequential palace clashes rarely look like war. They look like cold rooms, careful words, long pauses, drafted notes, altered diaries, redirected briefings. They look restrained, yet inside that restraint, entire futures are negotiated. What made this moment so extraordinary was that the emotional truth and the constitutional truth had collided at the same time. The emotional truth was that a son had been carrying more uncertainty than anyone should be asked to carry in silence. The constitutional truth was that the system had already begun planning around the consequences of that uncertainty, and simply removed the last layer of polite concealment between the two. By then, the national conversation had moved beyond curiosity into meaning. Commentators began asking what William's next move would reveal about the monarchy itself. Would it reveal a system brave enough to prepare without panic, or a system still too afraid of appearances to admit how heavily the future had already entered the room? The country was no longer only watching William. It was watching whether the institution could tell the truth without breaking its own image. Then came the first real clue. William appeared at a public engagement soon after the revelation, and nothing on paper about the event was dramatic. No constitutional speech, no announcement, no extraordinary wording. Yet those who understand royal staging notice the shift. His bearing was not heavier exactly, but firmer. His interactions were warm, but more deliberate. He spoke not like a man improvising his way through turbulence, but like someone who had accepted that waiting passively was no longer the same as being loyal. Catherine beside him seemed equally settled, not triumphant, not anxious, resolved. That visual mattered because monarchy is a theater of signal. A single composed appearance can calm speculation more effectively than 10 anonymous briefings. The country saw something new without being directly told what it was. William looked like a man who had made an inner decision. Behind the scenes, that decision reportedly took shape in 3 parts. First, he would request and accept a more defined continuity role in internal planning, ensuring that crucial briefings no longer reached him too late or too selectively. Second, he would support a more coherent distribution of senior obligations, reducing the dangerous gap between what the palace privately expected and what it publicly admitted. Third, he would do all of this while preserving visible deference to the king, refusing any step that could be framed as a shadow takeover. It was a delicate balance, but it was a balance Anne believed had become not only possible, but necessary. In simple terms, William's next move was not rebellion, it was acceptance. Acceptance that the future could no longer be managed as if it were merely theoretical. Acceptance that duty sometimes arrives before permission does. Acceptance that protecting the monarchy may require protecting it from its own instinct to delay painful clarity. Acceptance, too, that love for a father and loyalty to a sovereign can coexist with a demand for institutional honesty. There is a reason this struck such a deep nerve across the country. Most people will never live inside palaces, or read state papers, or navigate ceremonial precedents. Ceremonial precedents, for those outside that world, is simply the formal order that determines who stands where, who moves when, whose role signals what. But people do understand family burden. They understand what it means when the strongest person in a family finally says the thing no one wanted said. They understand the moment when silence stops feeling noble and starts feeling harmful. That is what Princess Anne recognized. She did not reveal the palace secret to weaken the monarchy. She revealed it because she believed the monarchy was at greater risk if those closest to it continued behaving as though preparation could remain invisible forever. She had watched the burden gathering around William. She had watched the institution preparing around that burden. And she had reached the point where withholding the truth no longer looked like loyalty. It looked like drift. In the final days of the immediate storm, there was one more scene that those near the family would later describe in almost symbolic terms. Charles and William were seen together, not in a grand ceremonial frame, but in a setting quiet enough to feel almost private, even though cameras were present. They stood side by side with the strange composure that only public duty can force upon private complexity. No one could hear their words. No one needed to. The image itself carried the message. The present reign was still standing. The future reign was no longer pretending it had all the time in the world. Some saw sadness there. Others saw strength. The truth was probably both. Anne's role in all of this remained characteristically unsentimental. She did not embark on a public campaign. She did not give dramatic elaborations. She did what she has always done at her most consequential moments: act, endure the noise, and move on. Yet the consequences of her action lingered. William's next move had changed because his choices had changed. He was no longer operating inside uncertainty that could be politely denied. The palace secret had been named. The burden had been illuminated. The path ahead, while still difficult, was now at least visible. And perhaps that is the deepest moral tension in royal life. The institution survives by managing image, but it is renewed only when image and truth can meet without destroying one another. Too much exposure can wound a monarchy. Too much concealment can hollow it out. The balance between those two is rarely found in comfort. It is found in painful moments like this, when someone inside the walls decides that preserving the future requires a harder honesty than preserving the present had allowed. William's next move, then, was not simply about scheduling or appearances or expanded briefings. It was about stepping into a different moral position, not claiming the future, but consenting to carry it more openly. Not replacing his father, but standing where the institution had already begun placing weight. Not abandoning family tenderness, but understanding that tenderness without clarity can become another form of injury. The country may remember the headline as a palace shock, but inside the royal family, the truth was far more intimate. A sister forced a brother to acknowledge what the system was already doing. An aunt forced a nephew to stop waiting for permission to recognize his own burden. A son and a father were pushed toward a clearer honesty neither had wanted to arrive this way, and a future queen stood quietly in the middle of it all, helping transform strain into steadiness. This was not an ending. It was a disclosure. It was not a collapse. It was a correction. It was not a farewell to the present. It was the first unmistakable admission that the future had already entered the room. In the end, that may be what makes this moment so powerful. The monarchy chose preparation over denial, even if it had to be dragged there by the blunt courage of Princess Anne. Love and duty could no longer remain in the same easy form. Protection and control could no longer be confused. The family remained wounded, but perhaps more honest. And William, now unable to pretend that time alone would solve what the palace had already begun preparing for, stepped closer to the role history was already placing in front of him. Thanks for watching. Please do not forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.